The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Buckingham Palace, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. It was just past 7 in the morning, and the palace was already buzzing with activity. Staff members moved quietly but quickly through the corridors, their footsteps muffled by thick carpets that had witnessed decades of royal history. In the eastern wing of the palace, near the Queen's private quarters, stood guard Thomas Wilson. He had been at his post since 5:30 that morning, as he had done every weekday for the past 15 years. Thomas wasn't just any guard. He was one of the most respected members of the palace security team, a man whose dedication to the royal family was known throughout the entire staff. Thomas had served his country long before he ever set foot in Buckingham Palace. He had spent 8 years in the British Army, including 2 tours in Afghanistan where he had earned several commendations for bravery. His military record was spotless, filled with praise from commanding officers who spoke of his courage, integrity, and unwavering sense of duty. When he left the army, the transition to civilian life had been difficult for him, as it was for many veterans. But then came the opportunity to serve the royal family as a palace guard, and Thomas had found his calling once again. The job meant everything to him. It wasn't just about the steady paycheck or the prestige of working at Buckingham Palace. For Thomas, it was about continuing to serve something greater than himself. He took pride in every aspect of his duties, from the way he stood at attention for hours without moving, to the careful attention he paid to every detail of his uniform. His boots were always polished to a mirror shine, his brass buttons gleamed, and his bearing was that of a soldier who understood the honor of his position. The other palace staff had grown to respect Thomas over the years. The housekeepers would nod politely as they passed him in the corridors. The kitchen staff sometimes brought him a cup of tea during his long shifts, though he rarely had the chance to drink it while on duty. Even the senior palace officials treated him with the kind of respect usually reserved for much higher-ranking employees. This wasn't common in a place where hierarchy meant everything, but Thomas had earned it through his consistent professionalism and quiet dignity. Queen Camilla had been making her morning rounds through the palace for several months now. It had become part of her routine since taking on more responsibilities as queen consort. She would walk through different sections of the palace, observing the staff at work, sometimes stopping to ask questions or make comments about the way things were being done. Some staff members appreciated her interest in the daily operations of the palace. Others found her attention somewhat intimidating. The truth was, Queen Camilla had very specific ideas about how things should be run. She believed in maintaining the highest standards, and she wasn't afraid to speak up when she felt those standards weren't being met. She had grown up in a world where attention to detail mattered, where small mistakes could reflect poorly on the entire household. Now as queen, she felt it was her responsibility to ensure that Buckingham Palace continued to operate at the level of excellence that the British people expected. On this particular morning, Queen Camilla was making her way through the eastern corridor, accompanied by 2 of her ladies-in-waiting and a senior palace administrator. They were discussing the arrangements for an upcoming state dinner when she noticed guard Thomas standing at his post. She had passed him many times before, always noting his professional demeanor and immaculate appearance. But today, something caught her eye. The palace had been undergoing some minor renovation work in recent weeks. Construction dust and debris were an ongoing problem, despite the best efforts of the cleaning staff. Workers had been coming and going, carrying equipment and materials through corridors that were normally pristine. It was an unavoidable inconvenience, but one that everyone was trying to manage as best they could. Thomas had been dealing with this challenge like everyone else. His post required him to stand in an area where workers had been passing through regularly, tracking in dust and small bits of debris from the construction site. Despite his best efforts to keep his uniform spotless, the conditions were making it nearly impossible. He had requested permission to clean his boots more frequently during his shift, but had been told to maintain his post as usual and deal with any cleaning during his scheduled breaks. The irony was that Thomas probably cared more about the appearance of his uniform than anyone else in the palace. He spent considerable time each morning ensuring everything was perfect before he began his shift. He understood that as a representative of the royal household, his appearance mattered. But he also understood that his primary duty was to remain at his post and maintain security, even if it meant dealing with less than ideal conditions. As Queen Camilla approached, Thomas stood a little straighter, his eyes focused ahead as protocol demanded. He could hear the conversation between the Queen and her companions, something about flower arrangements and seating charts. The morning light was getting stronger now, filling the corridor with a warm glow that made the gold frames of the royal portraits gleam. The palace around them was a testament to centuries of British history. Every room held stories of kings and queens who had walked these same corridors, made decisions that shaped the nation, and maintained traditions that continued to this day. For Thomas, being part of this history, even in a small way, was a privilege he never took for granted. He understood that his role, while it might seem simple to outsiders, was part of something much larger and more important. The footsteps grew closer, and Thomas could sense that the Queen's attention had turned toward him. In his peripheral vision, he could see her slowing down, her gaze moving from his face down to his uniform. He maintained his position, breathing steadily, prepared for whatever might come next. This was just another morning at Buckingham Palace, or so it seemed. The daily routine of one of the world's most famous buildings was continuing as it had for generations. Staff members were going about their duties, maintaining the standards that kept the palace running smoothly. The Queen was making her rounds, ensuring that everything met her expectations, and Guard Thomas was standing at his post, doing the job he had done faithfully for 15 years. But sometimes the most ordinary moments can become extraordinary in ways that no one expects. Sometimes a simple interaction between two people can reveal truths about character, respect, and dignity that change everything. And sometimes the most powerful responses come not from those who hold the highest positions, but from those who serve with quiet honor and unwavering integrity. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, casting the same long shadows it had cast for centuries. But in the next few minutes, those shadows would witness something that would be remembered and talked about throughout the palace for years to come. Queen Camilla stopped directly in front of Guard Thomas, her eyes fixed on something that had clearly caught her attention. The conversation with her ladies-in-waiting came to an abrupt halt as she stepped closer to examine what she was seeing. The corridor, which moments before had been filled with the quiet murmur of discussion about state dinner preparations, suddenly felt heavy with tension. Thomas continued to stare straight ahead, maintaining his military bearing as he had been trained to do. His breathing remained steady, his posture perfect, but he was acutely aware that something had shifted in the atmosphere around him. After 15 years of service, he had developed an instinct for these moments when the routine was about to be broken. The Queen's gaze had settled on his left boot, where a small scuff mark was visible near the toe. It wasn't large or particularly noticeable unless someone was looking closely, but it was there. The mark had appeared earlier that morning when Thomas had been forced to step aside quickly to allow a construction worker carrying a large piece of equipment to pass through the corridor. In that brief moment, his boot had scraped against a piece of debris that had been tracked in from the renovation site. Under normal circumstances, such a minor imperfection might have been overlooked or addressed quietly through the proper channels. Palace protocol had well-established procedures for handling issues with staff appearance or performance. A supervisor might have a private word with the guard, or arrangements might be made for him to clean his boots during his next scheduled break. The palace hierarchy was designed to handle such matters discreetly and efficiently, but this morning was different. Queen Camilla had been dealing with what she perceived as declining standards throughout the palace. Earlier in the week, she had noticed dust on a windowsill in the drawing room. The day before, she had found a flower arrangement that she felt was not up to par in the main entrance hall. She had been growing increasingly frustrated with what she saw as a lack of attention to detail among the staff. "Excuse me," Queen Camilla said, her voice carrying clearly through the corridor. The words weren't spoken harshly, but there was an unmistakable authority in her tone that made everyone in the vicinity immediately pay attention. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged quick glances, sensing that their morning routine was about to take an unexpected turn. Thomas shifted his eyes slightly, just enough to acknowledge that he was being addressed, but maintained his forward-facing position as protocol required. In his peripheral vision, he could see that other staff members in the corridor had slowed their pace, some stopping entirely as they realized something was happening. "I couldn't help but notice," the Queen continued, her voice now loud enough to be heard by everyone within 30 feet. "The condition of your boots." She gestured toward the scuff mark with one perfectly manicured finger. In all my years around the royal household, I have never seen such a display of carelessness in personal appearance. The words hit the corridor like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread outward from where the Queen stood. A housekeeping supervisor who had been walking toward them with an armload of fresh linen stopped short, unsure whether to continue past or retreat. Two junior staff members who had been discussing their afternoon duties fell silent and found themselves frozen in place, unwilling to draw attention to themselves but unable to simply walk away from what was unfolding. Queen Camilla stepped even closer to Thomas, her inspection becoming more intense. "This is precisely the sort of slovenliness that undermines the dignity of this entire household," she declared, her voice rising slightly. "When staff members cannot be bothered to maintain basic standards of appearance, it reflects poorly on everyone who works here." Thomas felt his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained neutral. He had faced hostile fire in Afghanistan, had stood his ground when rockets exploded around his position, had maintained his composure in situations that would have broken other men, but somehow this public dressing down in the corridors of Buckingham Palace was testing his self-control in ways that combat never had. The Queen wasn't finished. She began to pace slightly back and forth in front of him, her heels clicking against the marble floor with sharp staccato sounds that seemed to emphasize each word she spoke. "Perhaps," she said, her tone becoming more condescending, "you don't fully understand the privilege of serving in this capacity. Perhaps the standards that were acceptable wherever you worked before simply aren't sufficient for Buckingham Palace." More staff members had begun to gather at the edges of the scene, drawn by the unusual commotion but keeping their distance. A senior administrator appeared at the far end of the corridor, took one look at what was happening and hesitated before slowly approaching. The palace photographer, who had been on his way to set up equipment for a scheduled portrait session, stopped and pretended to examine his camera while watching the confrontation unfold. The Queen's criticism continued to escalate. "In my day," she said, her voice now carrying a note of disdain, "guards understood that their appearance was a reflection of their respect for the institution they served. They took pride in every detail of their presentation because they understood that they were representing something far greater than themselves." Thomas had heard similar words before, but in very different circumstances. His commanding officer in Afghanistan had spoken about pride in service and representing something greater than oneself. But those words had been delivered with respect, with an understanding of the sacrifices that service required. They had been words of encouragement and motivation, not weapons designed to humiliate and diminish. The gathering crowd was becoming more noticeable now. Kitchen staff had emerged from a nearby service corridor, drawn by the raised voices. A group of administrative assistants had slowed their walking pace to a crawl, clearly listening to every word being spoken. Even some of the more senior palace officials had appeared, standing at a respectful distance but obviously concerned about what they were witnessing. Queen Camilla seemed either unaware of or unconcerned about the growing audience for her public criticism. If anything, the presence of more staff members seemed to fuel her determination to make her point. "This sort of carelessness," she continued, "this lack of attention to detail is exactly what leads to the decline of institutional standards. When one person decides that the rules don't apply to them, it sends a message to everyone else that mediocrity is acceptable." The irony of the situation was not lost on those who knew Thomas well. Several of the staff members watching had worked alongside him for years and had seen his dedication firsthand. They knew about the extra hours he had volunteered during state visits, the way he had covered shifts for colleagues who were dealing with family emergencies, the quiet dignity with which he approached every aspect of his job. They also knew about his military service, though Thomas himself rarely spoke about it. But knowledge and the ability to act on that knowledge were two different things in the rigid hierarchy of Buckingham Palace. None of the watching staff members felt they had the authority or the position to intervene in what was clearly a situation involving the Queen herself. They could only stand there, witnessing something that felt increasingly uncomfortable and inappropriate, and hope that it would end soon. The morning sun, which had earlier cast such pleasant light through the corridor windows, now seemed harsh and unforgiving. The shadows had shifted, and the golden glow that had made everything look so elegant and peaceful had given way to something starker and more unforgiving. It was as if the very atmosphere of the palace had changed, reflecting the tension that was building in this one corridor, where a dedicated man was being publicly humiliated for a minor imperfection in his appearance. The crowd of palace staff had grown larger, forming a loose semicircle around the unfolding confrontation. What had started as a few curious onlookers had become a substantial gathering of housekeepers, administrative assistants, kitchen workers, and even some of the more senior staff members who had been drawn by the unusual commotion, echoing through the normally quiet corridors. Among those watching was Patricia, the head of housekeeping, who had worked at the palace for over 20 years. She knew Thomas well and had always admired his professionalism and courtesy. Whenever there were special events or state visits that required extra security measures, Thomas was always one of the first to volunteer for additional shifts. She had seen him work 18-hour days during particularly busy periods, never once complaining or asking for special consideration. Standing near Patricia was David, one of the senior administrative officers who coordinated security schedules. He was acutely aware of Thomas's service record, having been responsible for reviewing his performance evaluations year after year. Those evaluations were consistently excellent, filled with praise from supervisors and colleagues alike. David found himself shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot, watching a man he respected being subjected to such public criticism. The tension in the corridor was becoming almost unbearable. Several staff members kept glancing at each other with expressions of disbelief and discomfort. This wasn't how things were supposed to work at Buckingham Palace. While discipline and high standards were certainly part of the culture, public humiliation was not the way issues were typically addressed. The established protocols existed for good reasons, and what they were witnessing seemed to violate everything they understood about proper workplace conduct. Queen Camilla, however, seemed determined to continue her critique. "I wonder," she said, her voice carrying a tone of theatrical curiosity that made everyone listening wince, "whether you truly comprehend the significance of your position here. This isn't just any job, you know. This is service to the crown, service to the British people, service to an institution that has maintained its dignity for over 1,000 years." Thomas continued to stand at attention, his eyes fixed on a point straight ahead, but those who knew him well could see the subtle signs of strain beginning to show. There was a slight tightness around his eyes, a barely perceptible tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man exerting tremendous self-control. His breathing remained steady and controlled, the product of years of military training, but the effort it was taking was becoming visible to those who looked closely. "Perhaps," the Queen continued, warming to her theme, "the problem is that modern guards simply don't understand what real service means. In previous generations, men who served the royal household did so with a sense of honor and pride that seems to be sadly lacking today." These words hit particularly hard because they struck at the very core of what Thomas believed about himself and his work. Service wasn't just his job, it was his identity. He had dedicated his entire adult life to serving others, first as a soldier defending his country, and then as a guard protecting the royal family. The suggestion that he didn't understand service or take pride in his work was not just insulting, it was fundamentally wrong in a way that made his chest tighten with suppressed emotion. Among the watching staff members, some were beginning to exchange more obvious glances of concern and disapproval. Margaret, who supervised the palace cleaning staff, found herself gripping her clipboard tighter as she listened. She knew better than most how challenging it had been to maintain perfect cleanliness standards during the ongoing renovation work. Every day brought new dust, new debris, new challenges that everyone was doing their best to manage while still maintaining their regular duties. Another observer was James, a fellow guard who worked the evening shift. He had served alongside Thomas during several high-security events and had enormous respect for his colleagues' professionalism and competence. James found himself clenching his fists at his sides as he watched his friend being publicly berated. The code among guards was one of mutual support and respect, and seeing Thomas subjected to this treatment was almost physically painful for James to witness. The Queen's criticism was becoming more personal and more cutting. "I have to wonder," she said, beginning to pace again in that sharp-heeled, staccato way that was making everyone increasingly nervous, "whether you feel that the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to you. Whether you think that your position here is secure enough that attention, to detail is optional. This accusation was particularly unfair because anyone who knew Thomas understood that he was meticulous about following rules and protocols. He arrived at work early, stayed late when needed, covered for colleagues without complaint, and approached every aspect of his duties with careful attention to detail. The scuff mark on his boot was the result of unavoidable circumstances, not carelessness or disrespect. The administrative assistant who handled scheduling for the guard rotation, Rachel, was watching with growing indignation. She had processed countless requests from Thomas over the years. Requests to work extra shifts, to cover for sick colleagues, to take on additional responsibilities during busy periods. Never once had she received a complaint about his performance or attitude. The man being criticized so harshly was one of the most reliable and dedicated employees in the entire palace. Queen Camilla seemed to be building toward some kind of climax in her criticism. "Standards," she declared, her voice rising, "are not suggestions. They are requirements. And when those standards are not met, there must be consequences. Otherwise, we risk the gradual erosion of everything that this institution represents." The watching staff members were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. Several were looking around nervously, as if hoping that someone with sufficient authority might step in and redirect the situation. But the rigid hierarchy of palace life made such intervention extremely difficult. Who had the standing to interrupt the queen when she was clearly determined to make a point? Thomas himself was struggling with emotions he hadn't felt since his early days as a young soldier. The sense of being unfairly singled out, of having his dedication and professionalism questioned in such a public and humiliating way, was bringing back memories of military experiences where he had been forced to endure unjust treatment while maintaining his composure and dignity. The corridor had become uncomfortably quiet except for the queen's voice and the sound of her heels on the marble floor. Even the usual background noise of the palace, distant conversations, footsteps, the gentle hum of activity, seemed to have faded, as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. The morning light streaming through the windows now seemed harsh rather than welcoming, casting sharp shadows that emphasized the stark nature of what was happening. The elegant surroundings, the beautiful artwork, the centuries of history embodied in every piece of furniture and decoration, all seemed to stand in judgment of this moment when dignity and respect were being sacrificed for the sake of making a point about a scuffed boot. And still, Queen Camilla was not finished. She paused in her pacing, turned to face Thomas directly, and prepared to deliver what would clearly be the culminating blow in her public criticism of his service and character. Queen Camilla drew herself up to her full height and fixed Thomas with a look that seemed designed to make him feel as small as possible. The pause in her criticism had been brief, just long enough for the tension in the corridor to reach an almost unbearable level. When she spoke again, her words were carefully chosen for maximum impact, delivered with the kind of cold precision that could only come from someone who had never doubted their own authority. "You know," she began, her voice taking on a tone of mock thoughtfulness that was somehow more cutting than direct anger would have been, "I'm beginning to think that perhaps you would be better suited to work of a less distinguished nature. Something that doesn't require the level of excellence and attention to detail that service to the royal household demands." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Everyone listening understood exactly what the queen was suggesting: that Thomas wasn't good enough, smart enough, or dedicated enough to serve at Buckingham Palace. That his 15 years of faithful service, his military record, his consistent professionalism, all counted for nothing against a scuff mark on his boot that had appeared through no fault of his own. The reaction among the watching staff was immediate and visceral, even though they couldn't express it openly. Margaret, the head housekeeper, felt her face flush with indignation. She had worked alongside Thomas during countless events and emergencies, and she knew the kind of man he was. When there had been a kitchen fire during a state dinner 2 years earlier, Thomas had been one of the first to respond, helping to evacuate guests and coordinate with emergency services while maintaining perfect calm and professionalism. David, the administrative officer, found himself thinking about Thomas's personnel file, which he had reviewed just weeks earlier during the annual performance evaluations. The file contained commendation after commendation, letters of appreciation from visiting dignitaries who had been impressed by his courtesy and competence, and evaluations from supervisors that consistently rated him among the top performers in the entire security division. But Queen Camilla wasn't finished with her assault on Thomas's dignity and reputation. "I have to wonder," she continued, her voice growing louder and more theatrical, "whether you truly understand the honor that has been bestowed upon you by being allowed to serve in this capacity. Perhaps the problem is that you simply don't appreciate how privileged you are to be here." The suggestion that Thomas didn't appreciate his position was particularly galling to those who knew him well. Rachel, the scheduling assistant, remembered countless conversations with Thomas about the history of the palace, about the previous monarchs who had lived and worked within these walls, about the weight of tradition and responsibility that came with serving the royal family. His respect for the institution was genuine and deep, and his pride in his work was evident to anyone who took the time to observe him. "Maybe," the Queen said, beginning to pace again with those sharp, aggressive steps, "what we're seeing here is a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve something greater than oneself. Maybe the standards that were acceptable in your previous employment are simply not sufficient for Buckingham Palace." The reference to his previous employment was clearly meant as a dismissive dig at his military service, though the Queen probably didn't realize the full weight of what she was saying. Thomas had served his country in some of the most dangerous places on earth, had risked his life repeatedly to protect others, had earned medals for bravery that most people could only dream of. The suggestion that his military service had somehow prepared him inadequately for civilian work was not just insulting, it was profoundly ignorant. James, the fellow guard who was watching from the edge of the crowd, felt his hands clench into fists at his sides. He knew about Thomas's service record in Afghanistan, knew about the lives Thomas had saved and the courage he had shown under fire. The idea that someone who had never faced anything more dangerous than a disappointing flower arrangement could question Thomas's understanding of service and sacrifice was almost too much to bear. Queen Camilla seemed to be feeding off the tension and discomfort she was creating. Her voice grew more confident, more cutting, as if she was enjoying the display of power she was putting on for the assembled staff. "Perhaps," she said, "the real problem is that you believe your position here is secure regardless of your performance. Perhaps you think that doing the bare minimum is sufficient, because no one will hold you accountable." This accusation was so far from the truth that several of the watching staff members had to suppress audible gasps of disbelief. Thomas had never done the bare minimum of anything in his 15 years at the palace. He had volunteered for extra shifts during royal weddings, had worked through holidays when security needs required additional coverage, had taken on training responsibilities for new guards without ever asking for additional compensation or recognition. Patricia, who had coordinated with security staff for countless events, found herself thinking about the previous Christmas season, when Thomas had worked 17 straight days to ensure adequate coverage during the busy period of royal holiday celebrations. He had never complained, never asked for time off in lieu, never even mentioned the personal sacrifice he was making to ensure that the palace was properly protected. The Queen's attack on Thomas's character was becoming increasingly vicious and personal. "I think," she said, stopping directly in front of him again, "what we're seeing here is a perfect example of how standards deteriorate when people are allowed to become comfortable and complacent, when they start to believe that their employment is guaranteed regardless of their performance." The irony was that Thomas's employment was far from guaranteed. Palace security positions were competitive and demanding, with regular reviews and assessments that could result in reassignment or dismissal for any guard who failed to meet expectations. Thomas had not only met those expectations consistently, but had exceeded them year after year, earning recognition and respect from colleagues and supervisors alike. "Maybe," the Queen continued, her voice now dripping with disdain, "the solution is to find someone who actually wants to be here, someone who understands what an honor it is to serve the crown, someone who won't treat their responsibilities as an inconvenience, to be endured rather than a privilege to be embraced." The watching staff members were experiencing a collective sense of disbelief and outrage. They were witnessing something that went against every principle of fairness and decency they had been taught to expect in their workplace. The palace had always prided itself on treating employees with respect and dignity, on addressing performance issues through proper channels and established procedures. What they were seeing now violated every one of those principles. Thomas himself was fighting an internal battle that was becoming increasingly difficult to win. His military training had taught him to endure unfair treatment with dignity and composure, but it had also taught him to stand up for what was right when the situation demanded it. The question was whether this situation had reached that point, whether his duty to maintain protocol and respect was being overwhelmed by his duty to maintain his own dignity and self-respect. The corridor had become a theater for this psychological warfare, with Queen Camilla as the aggressor and Thomas as the target of her increasingly vicious attacks. The assembled staff members were unwilling witnesses to something they knew was wrong, but felt powerless to stop. And Thomas stood in the center of it all, maintaining his military bearing while absorbing blow after blow to his reputation and dignity, waiting to see how much more he would be expected to endure in the name of duty and service. Queen Camilla paused in her relentless criticism, taking a moment to survey the crowd of staff members who had gathered to witness what was becoming an increasingly uncomfortable spectacle. She seemed satisfied with the attention she had commanded. The way her words were clearly having an impact on everyone within earshot. The silence that filled the corridor was thick and oppressive, broken only by the distant ticking of an ornate grandfather clock that had measured time in this palace for over 2 centuries. When she spoke again, her voice carried a tone of finality that suggested she was preparing to deliver what she clearly intended as the crushing blow to Thomas's dignity and reputation. "I think," she said, drawing out each word for maximum effect, "that what we have here is someone who simply doesn't possess the character necessary for service at this level. Someone who lacks the inner quality that separates true servants of the crown from ordinary employees who are simply collecting a paycheck." The accusation cut deeper than any of her previous criticisms, because it struck at the very core of who Thomas was as a person. Throughout his military career and his 15 years at the palace, his character had been the foundation of everything he did. His commanding officers in Afghanistan had praised not just his courage and competence, but his integrity and reliability under the most extreme circumstances. His supervisors at the palace had consistently noted his honesty, his dedication, and his unwavering commitment to doing what was right rather than what was easy. Among the watching staff members, the sense of outrage was becoming almost palpable. Several people were exchanging glances that clearly communicated their shared disbelief at what they were witnessing. Margaret, the head housekeeper, was thinking about the time Thomas had found a valuable piece of jewelry that had been lost by a visiting dignitary. Instead of keeping quiet about it, he had immediately reported the find and spent his own time helping to locate the owner, refusing any reward or recognition for his honesty. David, the administrative officer, was remembering the incident during the previous year's state visit, when Thomas had noticed a potential security issue that everyone else had missed. Rather than ignoring it or assuming someone else would handle it, he had quietly alerted his supervisors and helped coordinate additional protective measures, potentially preventing what could have been a serious breach of royal security. But Queen Camilla wasn't interested in Thomas's track record, or the opinions of the staff members who had worked alongside him for years. She was focused entirely on making her point about standards and discipline, using this public confrontation as an opportunity to demonstrate her authority and her expectations for everyone who worked at the palace. "Therefore," she announced, her voice rising with unmistakable authority, "I am removing you from your post for the remainder of the day. You will report to your supervisor for reassignment to duties that are more appropriate to your apparent level of commitment and capability." The words hit the corridor like a thunderclap. Public dismissal from a post, even temporarily, was a serious disciplinary action that would go into Thomas's permanent record. More importantly, it was being done in front of his colleagues and peers, turning what should have been a private administrative matter into a public humiliation designed to serve as an example to everyone else. The watching staff members were stunned by the severity and public nature of the punishment. Rachel, the scheduling assistant, found herself thinking about how she would have to document this incident, how it would affect Thomas's future assignments, how it might impact his standing within the security division. The thought made her feel sick to her stomach, because she knew that what was happening was fundamentally unfair and disproportionate to the minor issue that had started it all. James, the fellow guard, was struggling with his own sense of loyalty and duty. Every instinct he had was telling him to step forward, to say something in defense of his colleague, to challenge the unfairness of what was happening. But he also knew that any such intervention would likely result in his own dismissal and would do nothing to help Thomas. The rigid hierarchy of palace life made it virtually impossible for someone of his rank to challenge the Queen's actions. No matter how unjust they might be, Thomas himself felt something shift inside him as the Queen's words sank in. For 15 years he had endured the inevitable frustrations and challenges that came with any job, always maintaining his professionalism and composure because he believed in the importance of his work and his duty to serve. He had accepted criticism when it was deserved, had worked to improve when improvements were needed, had consistently put the needs of the institution above his own personal comfort or convenience. But this was different. This wasn't constructive criticism or legitimate discipline for a genuine performance issue. This was public humiliation for its own sake, punishment that far exceeded any reasonable response to a minor imperfection in his appearance that had resulted from circumstances beyond his control. More than that, it was an attack on his character and integrity that struck at everything he valued most about himself. The corridor seemed to hold its breath as Thomas processed what had just happened. The other staff members were frozen in place, unsure whether to disperse and pretend they hadn't witnessed the confrontation, or to remain and see how Thomas would respond to being dismissed from his post in such a public and demeaning way. Queen Camilla stood with her arms crossed, clearly expecting Thomas to accept her judgment without question, to apologize for his supposed failures, to express gratitude for the lesson she was teaching him about proper standards and behavior. The expression on her face suggested that she believed she had handled the situation perfectly, that she had demonstrated the kind of firm leadership that was necessary to maintain discipline and excellence throughout the palace. But as the seconds ticked by, marked by the steady rhythm of the grandfather clock, it became clear that Thomas was not going to respond in the way the Queen expected. His military training had taught him many things about duty and obedience, but it had also taught him about dignity and self-respect. There came a point in every person's life when they had to decide what they were willing to accept and what they were not, regardless of the consequences. The tension in the corridor was becoming unbearable. Staff members who had been watching from the edges of the crowd were beginning to shift nervously, sensing that something was about to happen but unsure what form it would take. The very air seemed charged with the potential for an explosion that could change everything about the dynamics of power and respect within the palace walls. Thomas took a slow, measured breath, his eyes still fixed on the point straight ahead that military protocol demanded. But something in his posture had changed. Something subtle but unmistakable to those who knew how to read the signs. The absolute stillness that had characterized his bearing throughout the confrontation was giving way to something else, a sense of gathering energy that suggested he was no longer simply enduring what was happening to him. The moment had arrived when 15 years of faithful service, a lifetime of dedication to duty and honor, and a man's fundamental sense of his own worth were about to collide with the arbitrary exercise of power and the demand for unquestioning submission to unfair treatment. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably no more than 10 or 15 seconds. In that brief span of time, Thomas made a decision that would change everything about the situation that had been unfolding in the corridor. It wasn't a rash decision or an emotional outburst. Instead, it was a carefully considered choice made by a man who had reached the absolute limit of what he was willing to endure in the name of duty and protocol. Thomas shifted his gaze slightly, just enough to make direct eye contact with Queen Camilla for the first time during the entire confrontation. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it represented a fundamental change in the power dynamic that had controlled their interaction up to this point. He was no longer simply a passive target for her criticism and humiliation. He had become an active participant in whatever was about to unfold. The Queen noticed the change immediately. She had been expecting submission, apology, or at most a quiet acceptance of her judgment. The fact that Thomas was looking directly at her, meeting her gaze with steady, unwavering eyes, was not part of the script she had written for this encounter. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed slightly uncertain about what would happen next. Thomas took another slow, controlled breath, drawing upon every lesson his military training had taught him about maintaining composure under pressure. He had faced enemy fire, had made split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. had commanded respect from fellow soldiers through his actions rather than his rank. All of that experience, all of those hard-learned lessons about leadership and dignity, had prepared him for this moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but perfectly clear, carrying easily through the hushed corridor to every person who was watching and listening. The words were simple, direct, and chosen with the kind of precision that only comes from absolute certainty about their meaning and impact. "Your Majesty," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "I served your husband faithfully." The 6 words landed in the corridor like stones dropped into perfectly still water, creating ripples of shock and understanding that spread outward from where Thomas stood. Every person who heard them immediately grasped their significance, their power, and their devastating accuracy as a response to everything Queen Camilla had said about his character, his dedication, and his worthiness to serve. The reference to King Charles III was not accidental or spontaneous. Thomas had chosen those words very deliberately, invoking his years of faithful service not just to the institution of the monarchy, but to the man who was now Queen Camilla's husband, and the sovereign they all served. It was a reminder that Thomas's dedication and loyalty had already been tested and proven over many years, through multiple changes in leadership and countless challenges and responsibilities. The Queen's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The confident, authoritative expression she had worn throughout her criticism of Thomas suddenly vanished, replaced by something that looked very much like shock. She had not expected any response at all, much less one that so quietly and effectively challenged the entire foundation of her attack on his character and reputation. Among the watching staff members, the impact of Thomas's words was equally powerful, but expressed in very different ways. Margaret, the head housekeeper, felt a surge of admiration for the quiet dignity with which Thomas had finally chosen to defend himself. She knew that what he had said was absolutely true. His service to the then Prince Charles had been exemplary, marked by the same professionalism and dedication that had characterized his entire career at the palace. David, the administrative officer, immediately understood the broader implications of Thomas's response. By invoking his service to King Charles, Thomas had effectively elevated the conversation above the level of petty criticism about scuffed boots and moved it into the realm of fundamental questions about loyalty, service, and respect. He had transformed himself from a victim being humiliated into a man asserting his dignity and worth, based on a proven record of faithful service. Rachel, the scheduling assistant, found herself thinking about all the times she had processed requests and assignments related to Thomas's work with the then Prince Charles. There had been official visits, private meetings, security arrangements for sensitive events, and countless routine duties that had required the kind of trust and reliability that were only given to the most valued members of the staff. James, the fellow guard, felt a deep sense of pride in his colleague's response. Thomas had found a way to defend himself that was neither disrespectful nor insubordinate, but was nonetheless powerful enough to completely change the dynamics of the confrontation. He had reminded everyone present, including Queen Camilla herself, that his value and worth were not determined by her opinion, but by his actions and service over many years. The corridor had become completely silent, except for the continuing tick of the grandfather clock. Even the usual background sounds of palace activity seemed to have faded away, as if the entire building was waiting to see how Queen Camilla would respond to being challenged. However politely and respectfully for the first time in the confrontation, Thomas maintained his direct eye contact with the Queen, neither aggressive nor submissive, but simply steady and confident. His posture remained perfect, his expression calm and controlled, but there was no mistaking the fundamental change that had occurred. He was no longer willing to accept unfair treatment, simply because of the hierarchy that governed palace life. He had drawn a line and was prepared to defend it. The power of his 6-word response lay not just in what he had said, but in what he had not said. He had not attacked Queen Camilla personally, had not questioned her authority or position, had not violated any of the protocols that governed interaction between staff and royalty. Instead, he had simply stated a fact that everyone present knew to be true and that completely undermined the premise of her criticism. The Queen found herself in a position she had not anticipated and was clearly not prepared for. She had expected to deliver a lesson about standards and discipline, to demonstrate her authority, and to resolve what she saw as a problem with staff performance. Instead, she was facing a man who had quietly but firmly reminded everyone present that his character and dedication had already been proven through years of faithful service to the royal family. The moment stretched on, heavy with tension and possibility, as everyone waited to see what would happen next in this unprecedented confrontation between authority and dignity, between the power of position and the power of truth. The aftermath of Thomas's six-word response created a kind of silence that seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone in the corridor with the force of its implications. It was not the ordinary quiet that might follow the end of a conversation, but something far more profound. The stunned hush that occurs when the entire dynamic of a situation shifts in an instant, leaving everyone involved struggling to process what has just happened. Queen Camilla stood frozen in place, her mouth slightly open as if she had been about to deliver another cutting remark, but had forgotten the words somewhere between her brain and her lips. The confident, authoritative expression she had worn throughout her sustained attack on Thomas's character and competence had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked very much like genuine shock. For perhaps the first time in the entire confrontation, she appeared to be truly speechless. The transformation in her demeanor was striking and immediate. Moments before, she had been the dominant force in the corridor, commanding attention, delivering judgment, exercising her authority with the kind of theatrical confidence that comes from never having that authority seriously challenged. Now suddenly, she looked smaller somehow, less certain, as if the foundation of her entire approach to the situation had been swept away by 6 simple words that she had not seen coming. The staff members who had gathered to witness what they thought would be a routine, if uncomfortable, disciplinary action found themselves processing something entirely different. What they had just heard was not defiance or disrespect, but a quiet assertion of dignity that was impossible to argue with or dismiss. Thomas had not raised his voice, had not violated any protocol, had not said anything that could be construed as insubordinate or inappropriate. He had simply stated a fact that everyone present knew to be absolutely true. Margaret, the head housekeeper, felt her heart rate increase as she fully grasped what had just occurred. She had witnessed many conflicts and confrontations during her 20 years at the palace, but she had never seen anything quite like this. A moment when someone in Thomas's position had managed to completely shift the balance of power without stepping outside the bounds of proper conduct. Her respect for him, already considerable, increased even further as she realized the skill and courage it had taken to find exactly the right words for such a moment. David, the administrative officer, was experiencing his own mixture of admiration and concern as he considered the potential consequences of what had just happened. On one hand, he was deeply impressed by Thomas's ability to defend himself with such dignity and effectiveness. On the other hand, he was worried about how Queen Camilla might react once she recovered from her initial shock. The palace hierarchy was not designed to accommodate moments when staff members, however respectfully, reminded royalty of inconvenient truths. Rachel, the scheduling assistant, found herself holding her breath as she watched the frozen tableau of Queen Camilla staring at Thomas while he maintained his steady, respectful gaze. She had processed enough incident reports and disciplinary actions over the years to know that what had just occurred was completely unprecedented in her experience. Staff members simply did not respond to royal criticism in this way, no matter how unfair that criticism might be. James, the fellow guard, was struggling with his own complex emotions as he watched his colleagues' quiet triumph. Part of him wanted to cheer, to somehow express his admiration for Thomas's courage and dignity. Another part of him was deeply concerned about the potential repercussions, knowing how the palace system typically dealt with any behavior that could be interpreted as challenging royal authority, regardless of the circumstances or justification. The silence stretched on, becoming more uncomfortable with each passing second. Queen Camilla seemed to be cycling through a range of emotions and reactions, shock giving way to confusion, confusion giving way to what might have been embarrassment, and embarrassment beginning to transform into something that looked very much like anger. But it was a different kind of anger from what she had displayed earlier, less confident and more defensive, as if she was beginning to realize that her public humiliation of Thomas had backfired in a way she had never anticipated. Thomas himself remained perfectly still, maintaining his respectful but unwavering eye contact with the Queen. His military training had taught him that sometimes the most powerful action is no action at all, that there are moments when silence carries more weight than words. He had said what needed to be said, had made his point as clearly and respectfully as possible, and now he was prepared to accept whatever consequences might follow. The other staff members were beginning to exchange subtle glances with one another, trying to communicate their shared amazement at what they had witnessed without drawing attention to themselves. Several of them were thinking about how they would describe this incident to colleagues who hadn't been present, how they would explain the remarkable transformation that had occurred in the corridor when Thomas had quietly but firmly reminded everyone of his faithful service to King Charles. The grandfather clock continued its steady ticking, marking the passage of seconds that felt like hours to everyone involved in the confrontation. Each tick seemed to emphasize the weight of the moment, the significance of what had just occurred, and the uncertainty about what would happen next. The ornate corridor, with its priceless artwork and centuries of history embedded in every surface, had become a stage for something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come. Queen Camilla finally began to show signs of emerging from her shocked silence, but her recovery was clearly difficult and uncertain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words that would adequately address what Thomas had said. The problem was that his response had been so perfectly calibrated, so respectful in form while being so powerful in substance, that any attempt to criticize or punish him for it would only make her look worse. The watching staff members could see her struggling with the situation she had created for herself. By making Thomas's dismissal so public and theatrical, she had ensured that any resolution would also be public and visible to everyone present. She could not simply pretend that nothing had happened or quietly reverse her decision without appearing to have lost face in front of her own employees. The tension in the corridor was becoming almost unbearable as everyone waited to see how Queen Camilla would respond to being, for the first time in the entire confrontation, completely outmaneuvered by a palace guard who had managed to remind her and everyone else that respect and dignity were not the exclusive privileges of those who held the highest positions in the royal hierarchy. The standoff between Queen Camilla and Thomas lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. During that brief span of time, the Queen's face went through a series of subtle changes that revealed her internal struggle to find a way out of the situation she had created for herself. The confident authority she had displayed throughout the confrontation had completely evaporated, replaced by visible uncertainty and what appeared to be growing embarrassment. Finally, without saying another word, Queen Camilla turned on her heel and began walking away from the scene. Her departure was swift but dignified, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the same sharp rhythm that had punctuated her earlier criticism, but now sounding more like retreat than advance. Her ladies-in-waiting and the senior administrator who had been accompanying her exchanged quick, uncertain glances before hurrying to follow her, clearly unsure about what had just transpired, but understanding that their morning routine had been dramatically disrupted. As the Queen's entourage disappeared around a corner at the far end of the corridor, the silence that had gripped the assembled staff members began to break, but it didn't shatter all at once with noise and conversation. Instead, it dissolved gradually, replaced by quiet murmurs of amazement, disbelief, and admiration for what they had just witnessed. Thomas remained at his post, resuming his forward-facing stance as if nothing unusual had occurred. But the subtle changes in his posture, a slight relaxation in his shoulders, a barely perceptible deepening of his breathing, indicated that he was processing what had just happened and its potential implications for his future at the palace. He had crossed a line that he had never crossed before, had challenged royal authority in a way that was respectful but unmistakable, and now he would have to live with whatever consequences might follow. Margaret, the head housekeeper, was among the first to approach him, though she waited until most of the crowd had dispersed before doing so. "That was beautifully done," she said quietly, her voice filled with admiration and concern in equal measure. "But I hope you're prepared for whatever comes next." Thomas nodded slightly, acknowledging both her praise and her warning, but he didn't speak. There was nothing more that needed to be said about what had occurred. David, the administrative officer, was already mentally preparing the incident report that would inevitably be required. But he found himself struggling with how to describe what had actually happened. The official palace procedures for documenting staff disciplinary actions had no category for situations where a guard had been publicly criticized by royalty, had responded with a statement of historical fact about his service record, and had thereby completely shifted the dynamics of the encounter in his favor. The news of the corridor confrontation spread through Buckingham Palace with the kind of speed that only truly extraordinary events achieve. By lunchtime, staff members in every department were discussing what had happened, often in hushed tones but with unmistakable excitement and admiration for Thomas's quiet courage. The story grew slightly in the telling, as stories always do, but the essential facts remained consistent. Queen Camilla had publicly humiliated a dedicated guard over a trivial matter, and the guard had responded with 6 words that left her speechless and forced her to walk away. Rachel, the scheduling assistant, received a call that afternoon from her supervisor asking for a detailed account of what she had witnessed. As she described the incident, she found herself emphasizing Thomas's respectful tone and proper protocol throughout the entire encounter, making it clear that his response, while unprecedented, had been entirely appropriate under the circumstances. She wanted to ensure that anyone reviewing the situation would understand that Thomas had not been insubordinate or disrespectful, but had simply defended his dignity and service record when they were unfairly attacked. James, the fellow guard, made a point of seeking out Thomas during the shift change that evening. "The whole security division is talking about what you did," he said with obvious pride in his colleague. "Everyone's saying it was about time someone stood up to that kind of treatment." Thomas appreciated the support, but he was careful not to encourage any kind of wider confrontation with royal authority. What had happened in the corridor was between him and Queen Camilla, and he had no desire to turn it into a broader challenge to the palace hierarchy. The most significant development came 3 days later, when Thomas received a formal commendation for his years of exemplary service to the royal family. The timing was clearly not coincidental. Someone in the palace administration had decided that Thomas's service record needed to be officially acknowledged and reinforced. The commendation, signed by senior palace officials who had been briefed on the corridor incident, praised his unwavering dedication, professional excellence, and steadfast loyalty to the crown. The document made specific mention of his service during the transition from Queen Elizabeth II to King Charles III, highlighting his role in ensuring continuity and security during a period of significant change for the monarchy. While the commendation never directly referenced the confrontation with Queen Camilla, its timing and language made it clear that palace leadership wanted to send a message about Thomas's value and standing within the institution. Queen Camilla herself made no further public statements about the incident, and there were no additional attempts to discipline or reassign Thomas. Staff members who had expected some kind of retaliation were surprised by the lack of follow-up action, though some speculated that the Queen had been advised by her staff that pursuing the matter further would only draw more attention to an encounter that had not reflected well on her judgment or leadership style. The longer-term impact of the corridor confrontation extended far beyond Thomas's individual situation. Word of the incident reached other royal households and staff organizations, becoming something of a legend about the importance of treating all employees with respect and dignity, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. The story was told and retold, often with Thomas serving as an example of how someone could defend their dignity and principles while still maintaining proper respect for authority. For Thomas himself, life at the palace gradually returned to its normal routine, but with some important differences. His colleagues treated him with even greater respect than before, recognizing him not just as a skilled and dedicated guard, but as someone who had shown remarkable courage in defending his integrity. Senior staff members who had previously known him only by reputation made efforts to acknowledge his service more directly, and his opinions on security matters carried additional weight in departmental discussions. Perhaps most importantly, the incident established a new understanding within the palace about the limits of acceptable behavior in staff interactions. While the royal family would always maintain their authority and expect high standards from their employees, the corridor confrontation had demonstrated that even the most respectful and dedicated staff members had limits to what they would accept in the name of duty and protocol. The scuff mark on Thomas's boot which had started the entire confrontation, was forgotten almost immediately, but his 6-word response, "Your Majesty, I served your husband faithfully," became part of palace lore, a reminder that true service is built on mutual respect, and that dignity is not determined by rank or position, but by character and integrity that remain constant regardless of circumstances.